Hello and welcome to this SwiftUI video. My name is David Thorne. If you want to be able to master loading images in the background asynchronously using Swift for SwiftUI applications or UIKit applications or AppKit, this code is going to work for all of them. So this video is going to go through this nice and slowly, and we're going to explain every single step. So by the end of this video, you will have mastered understanding how to download images in the background and display them in SwiftUI. With that said, let's get started. So we're going to just call this project master async, and we're going to be using SwiftUI and the language Swift. Don't need any storage or tests. Okay, now that project is created, I'm just going to move it over to iPhone 15. Now, like I said, this video is going to be all about how to master downloading the images. There is the image view or the image component that we've got in SwiftUI. You also have the async image with URL, but they are just not, well, the image is perfectly fine, but the async image is just not flexible enough. And there's so many other things that you have to be able to do. The async image is just not good enough. All right. So with that said, just forget about using async image. Just understand how to do this, and you'll have to write this code once and once only. And it will more than likely last a good couple of years before you have to change the code once again. So with that said, we need to create, first of all, our own custom view. All right. And this is the view that you're going to use in all of your projects when you want a asynchronous image. We're just going to call it nice and simple image view. All right. And in here, we're going to say then the body and sum and view in here. All right. And in the beginning, what we're going to return here is we are going to change this state object in a minute. All right. And this is going to be a response, and it is going to be a UI image. We're going to change all of these things as we go through. Okay. So when we get here, we're going to say if we've got an image, then we're going to display that. Otherwise, we're going to display a progress view just with a label for loading. Now, this is down to you how you want to display this, all right? And let's just put our image view here instead, okay? And you can see now we have this loading view. This could be a part of another video, all right, how you want to display it, but the art is about how to download this. Now, we're going to need some way of doing an asynchronous request. We could do it with inside of a task inside this image view, but it's not the best way to do it, all right? So, there's multiple ways to do one thing, but it's always the best way, and the cleanest way to do it is always the way to actually do it. And what we're going to have here is we're going to have a, say, resource downloader, all right? And this is going to be an observable object. And inside of this, we're going to say have a published property, and this is then going to be our actual resource. Now, what we can do in the beginning is just have this as data. We can change it in the future as we go through, but just to keep it nice and simple in the beginning, we're going to say it's going to be data. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to add this resource downloader to our image view so we can access this resource instead of this resource here, okay? And what we'll do is we'll just remove this, and we're going to say state object instead, because this is an object that we're going to be using, an observable object. And so in order for SwiftUI to keep this object, this resource downloader, and available to us upon different views, we're going to need to define it as a state object. So with that, we're going to say, we're going to call this then the downloader, and we'll say resource downloader here. Okay. Now we need to instantiate it in some way. Otherwise, we're going to have to start passing it in the image view. Now, because it's state says that basically whichever view that you define something with state, it means that that view owns this state. And we are saying that this image view owns this resource downloader, which means we are allowed to instantiate it ourselves, which means we don't want it being passed in from outside. So here we'll make an init, and here we need to make our downloader, and we're going to say resource downloader here first of all. And now we have this downloader, we need to assign it to the downloader. Now we can't just do it, we need to have a state object. So we need to instantiate a state object with a wrapped value, and there we're going to use the downloader instead, right? So now we have our downloader here. We can say downloader.response instead, okay? And we know at the moment this response is data. We're going to change it in the future, all right? But we're going to go through this step by step. So now when we say if let image is equal to downloader response, we know that this is data rather than an image. So let's just rename it to be data instead. And what we want to display is an image. And that image is going to take an UI image, all right? And we're going to create this UI image using the data that we have just received instead, okay? And that is going to be an optional image as well with this one data. So if we take away the force unwrap, you can see we have a problem, all right? But what we can do here instead is we can just say if UI image here, we can wrap this here instead and say UI image here. And now we know for sure that we actually have a UI image rather than force unwrapping it. All the time that we don't have an image, we can just display our progress view instead, okay? So now we just need some way of loading this data. So within inside of our resource downloader, we're going to make a function and say load. And this function is going to take a URL, and it is going to be an optional URL. Now, if we have an optional URL, we don't have anything to download, so we're just going to say guard let URL equals URL, and we'll return. And we're done here because there's no point trying to download an optional URL because it's not going to do anything with us. Now, the next thing that we need to do is we need to create a URL session, and we're going to use the shared one. As we move through, we're going to create our own session, but for the time being, we're going to do it this way. And then we're going to use data task publisher, and this is where combine comes into it. And as you can see here, it says the default one is then the URL, but we need a request because the request is going to allow us to be able to cache the response that we get, which means we won't have to do that request again in the future or a second time and third time if we do it correctly. Now, we're not going to be able to use that totally with the URL session shared, but we're going to fix it as we go through. So for the time being, let's just put it down to using normal code. And when we do it, we're going to say cache policy, and here we're going to say return cache else load. And what this is saying is that if you've got this data already, use that instead. Otherwise, I want you to load it, all right? Now, like I said, it's not going to work with URL session shared. We're going to have to create our own one, but we're going to get through to that. So something that we're going to need is combine, because we're using combine here, because we're going to need to store the response, the cancelable, to this as well. And here we can just say the cancelable here is just a set of cancelable, of any cancelable. And basically, when we use this one data task publisher, we're going to say sync first of all. Now, if you're new to combine, then this video is going to highlight to you how powerful combine is, right? And when we call sync is going to respond with this any cancelable, and this is going to allow us to be able to cancel this one request in the event that we need to cancel it. So we're gonna say to URL session, hey, I want you to store this with inside of this one set here. We can return it, we can add it manually, but this is a nice convenience method that will store it inside of this one set. Okay, inside of this sync completion, this is what is going to be called once, and it's going to be called based upon if it's finished. If it's finished, then we know we're done. But all we really care about is this error, okay, this failure. And in this, we are going to basically just say resource data is equal to nil, and otherwise we're going to break. All right, we're not really that interested in the completion part of it, because the completion part will come down here instead. Now, we now need to map some data, because right now we have data and URL response. Well, this is too early. We don't want the data and response down here. We've got combined, so we can use the transform up here instead. And what we want down here is we want we want an image actually, but in the beginning we're just going to have an optional data, and I'm going to show you how we're going to get through this. All right. So right here we want to be able to return an optional data here, but before we do that, we're going to check to see whether the response was successful, because it's no point us trying to pass that data if it doesn't have any data. So we say here response, and we need to convert this to a HTTP URL response, because here I want to be able to check the status code. Let's just remove this for the time being. Whoops, remove this for the time being. I want to be able to check the status code of the HTTP request, and if it's 200, then we know that the server said everything is perfectly fine, right? If it's not 200, here is where we're going to return nil. We're saying, hey, we don't have any data, so let's just be nil. The next thing is, because we know that we've got the response status code that we wanted, we now need to check this data, because can we actually do something with this data? So we want to say, because we've got bytes here in data, we want to know if it's not empty, then go on, right? Otherwise, if it is empty, then we can just return nil once again to say, hey, we don't have any data because it's empty, and empty doesn't help us. So now in this sense, we can now return our data, all right? And we're going to modify this as we go through. So in our receive value now, we don't have a response anymore. We have a data instead. And this means now we can come to say self.resource is equal to data, okay? And let's just clean this up here as well. And we can open up the canvas once again. So now we have our resource downloader. And as we can see right now, the loader is still there because we don't have a resource, which means we don't have an image, because we haven't actually triggered this one load URL yet. And within inside of our resource downloader, we could do it in the initializer here, but we're in the view. We want to do it when the view loads instead, right? And here we can say load. And now we actually need this URL. So let's just give our image view a URL now instead. And let's make it optional. And we're going to need this later. So we're just going to save it as, we don't need to have it as a state or anything like that. We'll just say self URL is then equal to a URL, and if we decide to call this downloader once again, then we want to save this URL all the time. Okay, so now we have this URL here, and we should now see that we have a problem. And where's our problem? Missing argument. Yes, of course. We now need our URL within inside of our content view, all right? Which means we're all working up until now. And I've got an image ready for us to use. Okay, and we will just paste this in here because it's quite a long one. And we'll say URL string and place that in there. And now that we've got this, if we resume this, you should see we now have an image, which is super nice. So with our image view, we could now come into here and say resizable, and also then scale to fit as well. And we have our image below. And because it's the Borussia Dortmund Stadium, Hello World's just not going to do. We're going to say Hey B4B instead. All right. So now we have our image inside. So let's just walk and talk through exactly what we've done here. Let's get rid of the canvas once again. Inside of our content view, we've said, hey, we want this image view that we've created, and we've passed it a URL that we created. And obviously this URL is optional still right now because it's an optional one with string. So it could be that the URL is also invalid, and that's why we're just allowing an optional URL to come. So we now pass that to our image view as an optional URL. We save it just in case we need reference to it later. It's not a state object, it's just a constant property. And now we instantiate our resource downloader, and we add it to our state object. So remember that when this image gets saved, or sorry, when this image gets viewed on the screen, displayed or rendered on the screen, this image view struct is removed from SwiftUI. It doesn't exist anymore. The image gets rendered, and then when it needs to do a re-render, this image view gets created once again. This state object gets reassigned with this class that we have in memory. So SwiftUI is keeping a track or keeping a reference to this resource downloader, and every single time this image view has to be re-rendered, it's assigning this downloader once again, which means that we can use it every single time. All right. And so it means that within inside of our resource downloader, this resource data is persisted over multiple renders as long as it's there. So now that we know that we've called download, all right, and let's come inside of our if statement here, and let's make a reset button, all right. And we come here and we'll come into our image downloader, our resource downloader, and we're going to reset everything. All right, so we're going to reset the data. We'll say reset the cancelable, and then we'll reset the resource and put that to nil as well. And you'll see here that we will obviously be able to come here and we'll say downloader resets. And when we come back to the canvas once again, and we have the image, and we reset, and we go back to loading once again, because we don't have the UI image. For that reason, we're coming back to loading. So once we do the reset, let's come back to here. We could come back to here and say load with this one, but we don't have access to the URL there, so we have to come back to our reset here instead, and we say downloader and load once again with our URL. And you can see here we reload every single time and we get a new image. But this is doing a new request every single time. Okay, so let's make a published here var, and we'll just say counts, and this can be equal to 0 in the beginning. All right, and let's come back to our view and we'll say test, say loaded, and we'll say downloader counts. And basically every single time we download this image, we're going to increment the counts. All right, and so we say here the count is plus equal 1. All right, and you can see it's loaded once, reset twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, and so on. Right, so this count is only going to get fired or incremented when we receive a new value. Now what we want to be able to do is only use this data, this resource data, in the event that we have it. All right, well, we're going to create our request, and when we call load, right, we're going to say first of all, if data is equal to resource, we're going to return. So if we call load and we already have this one data, then we don't need to do anything. All right, but we know that's not going to get called, right? Because let's just say data exists here. Okay, and let's open up the terminal here. And when we do reset, we know we don't come here because we're resetting the resource every single time. Okay, so now we want to have a way of caching this data, this response, actually, the whole response within inside of the URL session. And we can do that by generating our own cache. And this is going to be a URL cache. And for us to be able to have our own URL cache, we're going to need our cache up here. So we're going to create our cache and say URL cache, and we're going to give it 100 megabytes of capacity from the memory, and we're also going to give it 100 megabytes capacity for the disk as well. Now you can define the destination of the URL cache too, but we're not going to. So now we have our request, our our request here. We need to use this, but what we can do here is we can say if, and this is where we're going to say data is equal to cache, and we're going to say cache for response for request. And if we do have data here, so if we do have cache response here, right, then we can set the data. So we can say the resource is equal to cache response data, right? And let's just print this out instead. And we'll say cache existed here. Let's run it again. You can see nothing is outputting down the bottom at the moment, all right? And but now, because this is shared, this URL session shared, it's because of this. This is not working properly. So what we'll do now is we come down to the session and we'll create our own session by saying URL session, and we'll say then config and make our config, and we'll say URL session config, and we'll just use the default one. And in here, we can set the URL cache to our cache, and we can also set the session cache policy to be then a return cache else load. And now once we've done that, we can now use our session instead of the URL session shared. And now when we run this, we should be able to say reset, reset, reset. And see, cache exists and our loader is not going up anymore. You see what I mean? All right. So now let's come down and let's add a delete button instead. All right. And we'll say delete. Inside of our downloader, we'll make a delete function too. And let's just copy this. And we'll say, first of all, delete. Whoops. And we now need to say our cache. And we're going to say remove all cache responses. One thing I really want to make a highlight to you, really important, that this might seem like it's a synchronous response. You might think that after calling this, all of these cache responses have been removed, but that's not true. It just happens when it happens. So don't expect it to happen straight away and don't wait for it. It just happens. You might have to delete it a couple of times for it to be gone. And don't waste your time looking into this. Don't waste it. It just happens when it happens. And here we can say reset as well, all right? Because we know that our cache has been deleted. And what we're going to do now is make another published. And this is then going to be cached. It's going to be a Boolean, all right? And it's going to be 0 here. And so when we get a cache, when we actually get a cache, we are going to say cached is equal to true, all right? Actually, so we don't want it there. My mistake. We want it to come here to say that cached is equal to true, all right? And this data is a little bit redundant now, because if we know we've got a resource, then we know we've got a cache here instead. And we know that session has saved it as well. So even though we are setting the resource here, we kind of know we've got data because it would have caught it here. And so if this hasn't got a response, if this hasn't got a cache response, this resource data is definitely nil. All right, so it's a bit redundant calling them both. So now we have that. Let's come down to our text, and we can now say text, and we can say here cached. Oh, sorry, we want downloader cached. And if it is cached, we'll say cached. Otherwise, we'll say loaded. Okay. And when we reset it, when we reset this, we can see that loader stays 0. And when we delete this, loader says 1, delete it, loader says 2, loader says 3, 4, and so on. And we reset it, we're still getting cached. And we need, obviously, to set on delete, we're going to say cached is equal to false, because we know the reset doesn't necessarily mean that we are removing the cache, just resetting it, all right? So when we come here, we can see reset is loaded 0. We delete, get loaded 1. We delete, we delete. You see we're getting loaded, and when we delete, we're getting cache. We press delete there, and it said cache still. Press delete again, we get loaded still, all right? So this is remember, the most important thing here is remember this removal cache responses doesn't necessarily do it on the first try. So we can see we got loaded here, and we press delete, and we're probably going to get cache here. And we did, and we press it again, and we get loaded, and we get loaded 6. We press reset, and we still get cached because we reset it, but we still have the cache in memory, and loaded went to 6. And we go delete, and reset, we want to have counts is equal to 0. All right, let's just do that instead, and we'll say delete, 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 and so on. So with that said, I hope that you've got something out this one video, and you can see that this resource downloader, we've got data here in a minute. We've got data here, and do we really need to do this information here? Do we really need to do this check with inside of our image view? No, this is where the mastery comes from it, right? We don't want this. We just want let image be downloader, and then resource. And we want this resource to be an image. And then we can come here and then just basically say the UI image here. Okay, and in order to be able to do that, we have to be able to change this data here to something, or we either have to say UI image, or we have to find another way to do it. And the clever way to do it is using generics, all right? And if you're not totally keen on generics, don't worry about it. We're just going to move the type parameter out to this area here, and instead we're just going to say this here. Now, we can see right now that the resource self.resource equals cache response.data is not going to work. Don't worry, we're going to fix that. We're going to come down to this try map, and we're going to say this is going to be a resource once again. This data is not going to like it either. And we come down to here and we say the resource here once again, which is this is not going to like it either. So we need to find a way to be able to do that mapping, right, to the type that we want. And we can do that with a closure. And we'll do then resource mapper here. And this is going to be an escaping closure that's going to take a data and it's going to return an optional resource instead of this one type. So now let's store this inside of our resource downloader. Let's just say var. We need to remove the escaping, all right, because this closure, this function type, is going to get saved. For that reason, we've got to use escaping because we're going to call it later on, okay? And now we can come down here and save it, resource mapper here, like that. Happy days. So now rather than accessing the data and setting the resource, what we do now is we say here, we can say here the resource mapper here, and we pass the data to it instead, and we're going to need it a couple more times. We can come down here instead, and we can just say self.resource mapper here, and now you can see that our resource now has the correct type, because resource mapper is going to return a optional resource, and it's going to receive the data, and that's what's going to get called here with data, and then give us a resource. So now our view model is all working. Let's scroll down to our image view right now, and we can see here that the resource downloader doesn't know what type it's supposed to be. Well, we know that it's going to be an image, a UI image here, and we can come here too and define that one there. But we actually don't need to define that one there because we've already told it what type it is. But we have our resource downloader here that needs this one closure. And here we can come in and say that we're going to have a UI image. Now we know that this closure is only going to get called when we have a $0, right? When we have a data, okay? So this closure will return our UI image. Let's check it again, and everything runs just as is once again. And we get the reset, we get the delete, we get everything that we want, and our reset counters. It's annoying me here because we want to do deletes. We go 1 and 2 and see how many times we do this request, and we reset it and so on. So this now allows us to, the resource downloader now doesn't care what resource this one is, right? It just says, hey, when I get some data, I'm going to call this one resource mapper, and you just give me a resource, right? That's all I care about. And let's just get rid of this prints now instead. The important thing is that you can save this resource downloader and use it multiple times. And you can save this image view multiple times as well. And you don't necessarily have to have this text here. You just need to have the image, and you don't need to have then the reset buttons and so on. And whoops, just have to have that there. And you have this normal image now as expected. All right. So I'm just going to quickly remove all these other texts just to concentrate on the actual code that we want, because the next question is how can you support AppKit? Right now we're supporting iOS because we have UIKit, or we're supporting anything that does have UIKit in it. So we want to be able to remove the UIKit from this one image view. So the next question we want to be able to ask is how can we support AppKit or any other kits? So we don't want image view just to be restricted to be only UI image. We want image view to be able to handle all of them. So how can we extract the responsibility out to the content view itself? Well, we can follow the same idea. We just need to add a closure here instead. And we're going to say completion. And this is going to take a data, and this is going to say view type, all right? And we can then add the generic type here, view type, and just let it be a view instead. Say, hey, to SwiftUI, let's let this be a view. Now, because we know we're going to use this later, we need for it to be escaping instead. And now our resource downloader, this now needs to return a view type or a view instead. Well, we can see right now that our UI image is just not going to work, right? So we can come here and we say completion handler and $0 here instead. Now our downloader, resource downloader, is all happy, but obviously our image, which is a view type, is not happy whatsoever. So let's take this out, and here we can say view type here, and we can just say, whoops, we can just say view type, because this is now a view. So our image view is now super happy because it abides by all of its conformance here. And now we're just down to this image view instead. So we now got to find a way to be able to tell this image view how to give us a UI image. Well, we know that already. We can just say here that we're going to have a UI image with the $0, right? But this then needs to go into an image with a UI image here. Okay, so now we have extracted the responsibility out to the content view itself. And with inside of our image view here, we now know that we are using UI image. So the only thing that we have to care about right now is, because we know SwiftUI is multi-platform, and so we don't have to do any additional imports or anything like that. The only thing we have to handle right now is whether or not we are running AppKit or UIKit, all right? And because SwiftUI is sat on top of all of these things. So here we can just use one of the macros and say if can import UIKit right here, and we'll say else if and then we'll say end if. If it can do UI kit, we'll do this one, right? And if it can support app kits, right, we'll do this one. And then we'll say NS image, and this is then NS image here. And otherwise we can actually change this to else if, that instead there. And then we'll say else, and then end if here. Otherwise, we'll just say empty view instead. And we build this just to show you that everything's running perfectly fine. And we run this again, and it is all working perfectly fine, right? To be able to change this, we've got to be able to be specific inside of our code here to say image resizable scale to fit. Now, if we now come to map kits, right? If we now come to the Mac, what it's for iPad, so this is not necessarily going to work. We would need to have to support. So by adding Mac here, we can come back over to our view, and when we come over to here, we can turn around and say my Mac here, and we can change this to then my Mac, and you'll see that we get a different set of code instead, and the image works. So we know that we're not getting any errors or anything like that, and we run this on my Mac. Let's wait for the window to pop up, and you can see the image is loaded perfectly fine. All right, and let's just close that one down. And when we come back over here and run it on iPhone once again, and we wait for it to load, and there you can see that we're loaded here. We've got published changes on back, so publishing changes from background 3 is not allowed. There we made an error. We need to come back over to our session, and we need to say receive on run loop main, and that will then take that error away. We'll just run it again to be clear, and now we get back to normal. And let's just go back to the Mac once again, just to show that it happens more than once. And there we go. So now we have a resource downloader for Mac and also for iOS. Nice and easy. And we support the two different types here by using the macros. And let's just say do this on here instead as well. And we run this again on Mac just to show you that it fits a little bit nicer. Okay, with that said, I hope that I've been slow. I hope I've been clear. I hope I've been detailed about how to do this. If I haven't, I'm more than happy to split whichever part down and extend on it even further. I know this is a little, if you're new to Swift programming, if you're new to SwiftUI, this can be a really scary thing to be able to understand how to do it, all right? Now, I've been programming for a long time, and I've spent hundreds, maybe thousands of hours writing Swift code, so I can do it relatively easy, okay? And I can see where you've got to write things, but I can tell you it only comes from practice. The more and more you know how to do these things, the easier it gets. And by no means think that you're going to be perfect. Sometimes you make mistakes, sometimes you forget things. That's what the likes of Google or ChatGPT are there for, to be able to ask the questions for or see how to do it. Otherwise, the documentation. Otherwise, in my opinion, the best way to do it is just trial and error. Try again all the time. With that said, I hope that you've learned something from this one video. If you did, please don't forget to like, subscribe, share. And if you've got any questions, feedback, or concerns, please let's start a conversation in the comment section down below. This video was supposed to be slow, was supposed to be detailed, was supposed to go over everything as much as possible. And if I haven't covered things in as detail as possible, please let me know and so on. With that said, thank you very much for watching. My name's David Thorne, and I will see you in the next video. Ciao, ciao, and goodbye.